What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's episode of Healing Unfiltered. I'm really excited for today's topic. I think it's very appropriate in society today. I know I've talked a little bit about this sprinkled in here and there throughout different episodes, but today we're going to really hit home on judgment, why we judge, what it means, what it actually is, what it represents psychologically, and the reason I was inspired to talk about this was because I saw a quote on Instagram that I'm going to read to you guys. It's a little paragraph. I think it really perfectly puts into perspective what judgment is, why it happens. And I think we can talk about today how we can challenge the judgments that we have, because let's be real, we are humans. We are going to judge. I think we're so fearful of coming across as judgmental. And yes, there is a level on that spectrum where we gotta like maybe rein it in if it is something that's influencing our lives and our relationships. But the matter of the fact is that every single human being makes judgments at some point in time. And I think it's just the degree to which we judge. We live in a very judgmental culture presently, especially with political tensions and mental health, even. And, what we see on TikTok and Instagram and like all of these things that are just shoved down our throats. So I think it's a really great time to look inward at our judgments and kind of evaluate, maybe challenge ourselves to look a little more closely in the mirror and see if we might be able to address some of the judgments that we have in a way that is full of compassion and curiosity, but also, like I said, challenges us to grow into maybe a more fulfilled version of ourselves. So I'm going to read this quote to you. It says, "Before you judge someone, understand this. Your judgment isn't truth, it's conditioning. It's your parents' voices, your first heartbreak, the neighborhood you grew up in, the religion that shaped you, the chaos you survived, the wiring that kept you safe. What feels right to you is just familiar, and familiar feels like truth. But judgment isn't about morality, it's about control. If I can label you, I don't have to question myself. If I can reduce you, my world feels safer. If I can be certain, I don't have to sit in the discomfort of not knowing." Oh my God. I think that when we talk about looking at our own judgments with curiosity and compassion, that is the way to do it. We're not saying, oh, you're being judgmental, that's bad. We're saying it feels right to you based on what you've been through, and what feels right is familiar. And for you, what feels like familiarity feels like truth. So anybody outside of that truth must be wrong, right? And it makes me feel safer to know that, oh, this is my truth. You must be wrong. We're going to dive into this. We're going to talk more about psychologically, like why this happens, what judgment really is, kind of break apart that quote. And my hope for you guys in this episode is that you can look at any judgments you have about yourself, others, the world, systems, groups of people, and really just be honest with yourself about what does my judgment of these other people or situations say about me. Okay, so what judgment actually is. And the quote, I think, does a really good job of defining this, but we're going to break it down more into like psychological terms. So judgment is this process that our brains go through to rapidly categorize different things, right? So at its core, judgment is a function of the brain. I've talked before about how we kind of assimilate information. We take information, we assess it, we put it in a category. In a previous episode, I used the analogy of little kids learning about animals and kind of learning the difference between this animal has four legs, fur, and a tail, and so does this one, but they're different. That's what I'm talking about here. So the brain rapidly assesses the information that we're getting and it puts it into a category. That is judgment. That is judgment to a T. We are assessing the situation and categorizing based on what we know. It's also a nervous system shortcut. Our nervous systems like familiarity, just like it says in the quote. It makes us feel safe. It makes things predictable. We don't like the gray. We like it to be black and white. We like to live in the safe zone of it's either this or this and nothing in between. Judgment allows us to do that. If I have a judgment of somebody based on what I've known in my past, there's something about that category that is threatening to me, threatening to my nervous system. It's something that shakes what I believe in or might shake the value that I have. So if I see it in somebody else, my brain perceives that as a nervous system threat. That's a threat to what I believe, even though it's not, even though we know that that person can go live their life the way they want to live their life and that can have nothing to do with me. If I haven't done the work to look inward and recognize that, or train my nervous system to recognize that, my nervous system's going to go up in arms. I'm going to get all fired up. I'm going to get all anxious and worried, maybe even angry, right? And it's going to project onto whatever that other judgment is versus recognizing, hey, we can simmer this down. We can look at what the threat feels like for me versus what the reality is. It's also a pattern recognition tool. And this ties in with my first point of categorization. It helps us to recognize the patterns that leave things feeling predictable. If I am, let me think of a good pattern. Let's look at sports, for example, pattern recognition. Sports and playing sports is really actually all about pattern recognition and judgments. We just look at it differently because we're not thinking about it through the lens of what we think of when we think of typical judgment. Okay, so I played volleyball. I was a defensive player, played in the back row. And I had to be able to recognize the patterns of what is going to happen when the other team is going to try to hit the ball over the net, right? So, certain things I would look for is their hand coming back to swing? Is their hand up to tip the ball? That's pattern recognition. My brain is judging the situation. I'm assuming what the other person is going to do so that I can do my job as a defender to keep the ball off the floor and help my team win, right? What are the versions of this in your daily life that are keeping yourself safe or helping yourself win? That's what we want to look at. Where are we looking for patterns in our lives, which typically show up as stereotypes? And this is why people say, well, there's stereotypes for a reason. There's some truth to stereotypes. Okay, because of pattern recognition, because of what you've learned. Your stereotypes are based on maybe the patterns that you've seen, yes, but also based on the patterns that you have seen through the lens of your judgment, through the lens of all of those things that quote listed of where you've learned these things from. So we take all this information in, we try to recognize a pattern, and the object of this is to keep us safe. We don't recognize this in the moment. We just think when we are arguing with somebody over some political issue, some group of people that we are stereotyping or have a prejudice against or are judging, we look at that and say, no, this is just my belief. I just believe this, right? Yes, but it's also a judgment based on what you've learned to keep yourself safe in some way. Keep your identity safe, keep your religious beliefs safe, keep your economical beliefs safe, keep your family safe. The list could go on and on and on. And I think that once we can recognize that our judgments come from a place of desire for safety, we can get to another place that feels more stable, less emotional. I'm not saying you have to change your beliefs at all, but I am saying that we can do without the hate and without the judgment. We can do with, yes, that's your belief and that's totally fine, but I truly do respect what somebody else's beliefs are as well. Judgment is what turns respect into hate. Judgment is what takes, this is a belief I have from just purely being a belief to hate. So we need to be able to look inward and look at the judgments that we have. I know I'm talking a lot about projected judgments, but I also want to talk a little bit about how these things impact how we judge ourselves. So one of the things I work with a lot of clients on is the judgments we have towards ourselves. We have these high expectations of us. We have this kind of view of ourselves that we have to maintain. And just like those definitions of judgment that I just listed off, the rapid categorization process, nervous system shortcut, pattern recognition, we are looking at all of the experiences in our lives and we're saying, how can I keep myself safe by judging myself? When really, we'll talk about this in a little bit, judgment just leads to feeling like shit. So the bottom line is whether we're judging ourselves, we're judging others, we're judging a situation or circumstance, we do this because it makes us feel like it helps us predict the future, assess safety, and maintain our identities. And again, because that feels so familiar, because that feels like the safest route, we really overemphasize the fact that that stuff is true. We really think if I make this judgment, it's going to help me predict the future versus I can assess this and make a judgment and have more information to then figure out how I'm going to handle the future versus knowing without a shadow of a doubt, like, yep, I was right. See, I predicted the future with that assessment or that judgment that I've made. That's not so accurate. Again, everything feels so extreme and we need to kind of scale it back to something that feels a little bit more balanced. Now I want to talk about why judgment feels like truth. That part of the quote that says, familiarity becomes our truth. Familiarity feels like truth. This is why challenging judgments is so hard, whether it's towards yourself, others, or a situation. Your brain becomes conditioned to look for these patterns, to assess the information. It takes all of that and kind of puts it into a code that then can be efficient. Instead of having to run through all this information every single time we encounter the situation, our brain associates these factors, these circumstances with this judgment, easy, boom, right? It's kind of that quick shortcut to being able to make a decision about something without having to run through all of the different factors every single time. That becomes really hard because in order to challenge judgments, we need to get our brain out of that cycle. We need to force our brain to stop that efficiency, go against what it wants to do more than anything in the world, which is be efficient. And we need to kind of force our brain to go back into that mode of reassessing the factors, reassessing the reality of the situation. And that's really hard when a lot of times these judgments that we are trying to challenge are from years and years and years of conditioning. And not only the length of time, but usually a lot of these judgments come from our formative developmental years. And during those years, the things that we learn sink in so much more deeply, are like sponges. I know it's like a common saying when kids are learning things, they soak it up like a sponge and then it sticks. I'm sure we all have those things that you think back and you learned as a little kid and you're like, this is some random fact that I learned when I was 7, and my brain just latches onto it as if it is the most important fact in the world. Our brains really take in that information. And then the other thing about these developmental years is these are the years we're discovering ourselves. And so we're soaking up so much new information every single day, every single second of every single day. And at the same time, we are forming our identities. So there becomes this fusion of the information that we are soaking up and the identity that we are forming. So the judgments that we learn when we are younger really become a huge part of our identities. So this is another reason why these judgments feel like truth, is because they're so woven into who we are. By challenging that judgment, it feels like a threat to our identity. It feels like we're challenging a version of ourselves or a huge part of ourselves. And yes, that might be true in some categories, in some situations, but it doesn't mean you have to erase that whole part of your identity. Again, this is where we want things to be black and white when they're really not. The black and white version of challenging judgments says if you challenge this, you're going to carve out a whole part of your identity. You're going to learn that this part of your identity is wrong or bad or you're not good enough. That's the black and white all or nothing version. Versus if I can challenge this judgment, if I can have some curiosity about it, that part of me, my identity doesn't really have to change. Just the way that I intake information might change. The way that I interpret a situation or the way that I might assess a situation might change. Doesn't have to change my beliefs. It might change my emotional experiences, but usually what's going to change in the long run is you're not going to feel angry. You're not going to feel scared. You're not going to feel shameful. So the things that are going to change are going to be for the better, usually, in most cases. So the big point here is that it feels like a huge threat to our identity. And so it feels like truth. It feels like fact because it's become so interwoven into who we are as human beings. Okay, so 16. So these things come from our family rules, our cultural norms, our religious practices, trauma, attachment, what kept you safe, what helped you learn your environment, who you are, who other people are. It makes sense. We can't shame ourselves for having these judgments either. That's one of the biggest things that I hear is like people sit across from me in my office and they'll have a thought that they really want to share, they really want to work through. And they'll be like, I sound like a piece of shit saying this. Like, I don't even want to say it because it sounds so bad. No, natural. You think there's any single person on this earth who doesn't have a shitty thought about another person or a bad thought about a circumstance or a snap judgment about somebody? The judgment itself isn't bad. It's what we do with it. Do we take it then and make it fact? Or do we recognize it and say, ooh, that was an interesting thought. Let me look at that. The thing that I want to keep in mind when it comes to these ingrained beliefs that turn into judgments is just because it's familiar, it does not mean that it is true. It means that it is practiced. It means that you've had years and years and years of practicing this to the point where it feels familiar. But that familiarity does not automatically equate truth. And that's where we need to be able to kind of pry it open just a little bit, just a teeny tiny bit, to be curious about it, to see if there are any harmful judgments in there, either towards ourselves or others, and just examine it. Like that's really all we're looking to do at the beginning. And my kind of call out to you is if you're somebody who's saying, I don't want to examine it, that's uncomfortable. That's, embarrassing. That's whatever, fill in the blank. It's shameful. I don't want to look at that. Well, doesn't that say something about the judgment itself? If you have beliefs, I would hope that your beliefs would be based in your values to an extent where you feel so strongly about them and so confidently about them that there isn't shame. You're not embarrassed of them. You feel good communicating them to other people. There's none of these manufactured emotions of anger, shame, guilt, resentment, all that nasty stuff that really weighs us down. That's how we don't want to feel about our beliefs. How we want to feel about our beliefs is calm, confident, maybe curious about other people's beliefs. I think if we can pry it open just to examine it just a little bit and challenge the discomfort that comes with examining those beliefs, that's all we need to get the ball rolling. Another thing I really want to talk about when it comes to judgment is projection. Projection is a word that's thrown out a lot. I think, especially in relationships, you're projecting your shit onto me. And it's, again, human nature to project. Whatever we have inside of us is going to come out in some way or another. A lot of times it comes out in projection. And a lot of times that projection comes through judgment. So I want to talk about a couple of different examples in which this projection might happen. So really common examples that we see, we might judge laziness, right? So somebody maybe doesn't like to work out, or somebody doesn't value hard work, doesn't want to work hard, right? They want to take the path of least resistance. If we really value working hard, we might look at somebody who doesn't and judge them for, oh my God, they're lazy. That's so bad. They're lazy. And on the flip side of that coin, we judge ourselves. I'm feeling so lazy right now. What a piece of shit I am, right? We judge that because we're so afraid of ourselves being viewed in that way, right? We might judge arrogance. We might judge confidence even. Sometimes people might confuse confidence with arrogance, but we might judge that because we're insecure. We might judge vulnerability. This is a huge one. We might look at somebody who's maybe more sensitive, more vulnerable, more empathic, right? More emotional, and judge that because we were taught that vulnerability was unsafe. So you see where I'm getting at with this? We judge what we are afraid of internally. And a lot of times our judgments come from those projections. We take whatever is inside, we project it onto others. Because if I've learned vulnerability is unsafe, vulnerability is bad. Vulnerability makes you weak. That's another really common one I hear. It's weak to cry, it's weak to show emotion, it's weak to be sensitive. If I believe that about myself, and then I see somebody else being vulnerable, I see somebody else crying, I see somebody else being what I would view as sensitive, well, then I'm going to say, ooh, my beliefs about that are it would make me weak. Therefore, weak. I don't like that. That feels unsafe, right? And not that somebody else being vulnerable is going to make you be vulnerable. It's not going to force you to do anything. That's their own shit, right? But our system recognizes that. Our system sees that and says, that's unsafe. That's not okay. We don't like it. Somebody else or ourselves. So we can see very easily how judgments come from these projections. And this is when we examine, when I talk about like kind of prying it open a little bit and examining what's going on there for our judgments, I want you to practice some empathy. And what you judge in somebody else, I want you to put yourself in their shoes. And I want you to look at that and think of not empathy for the sake of empathizing for that person, but to get maybe more awareness of your own judgment. How would you feel in that position? And if you feel shameful, if you feel weak, if you feel disgusted, if you feel any sort of hatred or anger, or if you can't even fathom putting yourself in their shoes because it just gives you this really uncomfortable feeling, there's likely something you're projecting there. There's likely something internal that is going on for you, and your judgment of that person says more about whatever's going on for you internally than it does about what you think about that person. And the thing that I think is why this is so important is because judgments are so, so harmful. We do it out of self-protection. We do it out of self-preservation, out of identity preservation. But the outcome is somebody else ends up hurt. Somebody else ends up feeling less than. Somebody else ends up feeling like they aren't good enough. And then somebody else internalizes their own judgments, and the spiral goes on and on and on. And I think it's such a shame that in society we end up hurting other people because of our own insecurities. That I think is one of the biggest it's one of the biggest pain points for me as a therapist and as a human being, when people can't turn the mirror around and look inwards and end up hurting other people because of their own shit, right? So I think this is a really important, very uncomfortable thing that we have to do to not only better the world, but better ourselves and feel better about ourselves, right? Like, how nice would it feel to come across somebody that you would have judged typically and be like, whatever, because you feel so confident in yourself, because it's not going to phase you what anybody else decides to do in this world, because you know at your core what is right for you and your beliefs and your safety. So when we project, it just takes it to a whole nother level. It can be damaging to ourselves and others. And I think that there's a lot of work we can do internally to minimize those projections and to learn, hey, I actually am safe. I don't need to fear this the way that I have. And maybe if this is something, for example, like vulnerability, maybe I could benefit from challenging the fear that has come with that and opening up that side of myself and altering what I've thought is my identity in a way that might feel a little more well-rounded, minimize shame, minimize resentment, anger, all those gross feelings. Okay, so with that being said, we're going to talk about how you can challenge your judgments without shaming yourself. That's a big disclaimer here. So when we challenge our judgments, we don't want to add more judgment. I see this a lot actually too, where people will be like, I just feel so lazy, right? And then we'll call it the judgment and like, oh, why do I keep doing that? I'm so stupid. And it just like, we're piling on the judgment, right? So we want to make sure we are challenging our judgment through curiosity and compassion. Those are two of the most important things to look at and to utilize when we're challenging judgment of ourselves or others, especially others too, right? So that example I just gave of, I feel so lazy. Oh my God, I feel so stupid. That is obviously judgment towards ourselves. But let's say you see somebody walking down the street with, I don't know, green hair, right? And you judge them and you're like, oh, that hair is so ugly, right? And you judge yourself for having that judgment. Oh, I'm such a piece of shit for thinking that, right? Why would I think that's so mean? Okay, you're judging yourself for that versus, oh, why did I react that way to that person's hair? What their hair doesn't impact me. So we're looking at it through curiosity versus shaming ourselves. So what we need to do, we can't just tell ourselves to stop judging because, like we said, this is coming from years and years and years of conditioning. This is coming from self and identity preservation. This is coming from making sure we are safe and our nervous system is intact and functioning. So we can't just tell ourselves to stop. It does not work that way. We need to notice it and we need to get curious. That is the part of doing this, like spreading it open it just a little bit and peeking inside. We notice it, we get curious. If that's where you're at right now, you pause there. It is a huge step to be able to look at your judgments of yourself or others and be able to acknowledge, okay, I noticed that that was a judgment. That is a huge, huge step to be able to admit to ourselves, like, okay, maybe that's something I need to be more aware of. And then the curiosity piece steps in and we can ask ourselves these 3 questions. What does this say about me? Again, not in a character flaw way, not in a, well, this says I'm a piece of shit person. No, what does this say about my own insecurities? What does me judging that person's green hair say about what I think of my own self-image, right? Number 2, what am I protecting right now? This is the biggest way to increase compassion because anytime we shift it to the lens of safety, we look at, okay, I'm protecting myself. There's so much compassion in that. Of course you want to be safe. So what am I protecting right now? And 3, is this about safety or discomfort? So am I judging this group of people because I feel unsafe, because I've learned along the way that this group of people is unsafe to me? Or am I judging vulnerability because it's uncomfortable and I don't like it. It's different. It's outside of my comfort zone. We need to identify, is this a safety thing or a discomfort thing? A discomfort thing is going to be easier to challenge because it's distress tolerance at that point. It is pushing through. It is exposing yourself to things that make you uncomfortable and feel different for you. The safety piece is going to be a little more challenging because your nervous system, your fight, flight, freeze responses have been wired around this, right? So identifying which of those types of judgments it is based in safety or discomfort is going to be really important to be able to then figure out what you need to do next to actually challenge it. But the first things we need to do is look inward. What does this say about me and my own insecurities? And what am I protecting? What am I protecting right now that's causing me to project this either outwardly or at myself? All right. So to wrap this up, I really would love you guys to reflect on how this conversation felt for you. If it felt uncomfortable, if you felt called out a little bit, if you felt validated, just kind of take a moment to really look at how how am I feeling about this? And where am I noticing this pop up in my life? When I kind of gave some of those examples, did a certain judgment come to mind that you're like, yep, I always judge that. I always have a reaction to XYZ thing. So we want to look at where am I most rigid, hardest for me to challenge these things, and what makes me instantly certain. What do I have this reaction where I'm like, nope, I'm not hearing any other opinion. I'm not hearing any other belief. This is what is right. This is what is true. And I'm sticking with it. Where are you most rigid? Where do you feel like you are 100% correct when it comes to a belief or a judgment or a perception? And what feels threatening and why? We really have to start looking at that, because that will allow us to kind of turn inward and make it about us, make it about our own healing and our own shit versus projecting it onto somebody else. So I hope this was helpful. I know it was a little bit kind of calling us out. I know that it's a harder topic. It's a harder conversation because it does feel really vulnerable, and it does have in society this kind of association with character. But I really want to emphasize we are all judgmental, and it doesn't mean we have to all stay judgmental. We can challenge ourselves. We can look inward. And not only, like I said, will that trickle into society and improve relationships, improve your community, it will really have a huge impact on how you feel about yourself, how you feel about yourself in relation to others, your safety, your identity, your confidence, all of that stuff. We want to clear out the shame, the judgment, the nasty feelings, the anger that come with some of these things, and get to a point where we can just feel confident in ourselves and not have to project anything onto anybody else. So I hope this was interesting and helpful and validating and helped you look inward just a little bit more than maybe you would have normally today. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, please, please, please let me know. Download this episode, share it with somebody who might be interested in hearing this information as well. Leave a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts, and I will be back next week with another new episode. Bye. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Healing Unfiltered podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone who might also love to tune in. And as always, be kind to yourself, others, and the world. See you next time.